The lantern flickered in the nursery window that November night in 1851, casting shadows that danced like ghosts across the magnolia trees. Inside, a slave woman named Ruth held a white child close to her chest, whispering words that would have gotten them both killed if anyone had heard. But someone did hear. And what Thomas Whitmore discovered when he burst through that door was not what he expected, not what anyone could have imagined, and certainly not what the laws of Virginia were designed to protect against. This is a story about trust placed in the wrong hands, or perhaps in the only hands that mattered. About a night that shattered everything a powerful man believed about ownership, loyalty, and the nature of evil itself. About how sometimes the monsters we fear are not the ones we've been taught to see. The morning it all began, Thomas Whitmore stood on the auction block steps in Richmond with a desperation that made his hands shake. 38 years old, a respected tobacco plantation owner, a man whose word meant something in Virginia society, reduced to this: scanning faces of enslaved women like he was choosing furniture. But he was not choosing furniture, he was choosing someone to save his daughter's life. Little Caroline Whitmore was dying, not from fever or consumption or any of the diseases that plagued children in those days. She was dying from silence. 6 years old, and she had not spoken a single word in the 8 months since her mother drowned in the James River. The doctors said there was nothing physically wrong with the child. Her voice simply refused to come, and with each passing week, Caroline grew thinner, paler, more like a ghost than a living girl. She would not eat unless forced, would not sleep without screaming nightmares that left her thrashing and sobbing without sound, would not let anyone touch her except to fight them away with small fists and silent fury. 3 governesses had quit. 2 nurses had been dismissed for cruelty when their patience ran out. The house slaves whispered that the child was cursed, that her mother's spirit had stolen her voice and was slowly pulling Caroline toward the river to join her in death. Thomas did not believe in curses, but he believed his daughter was slipping away from him, and he was powerless to stop it. So he came to Richmond on the advice of Dr. Taylor, Edmund Price, who said what Caroline needed was not another governess or nurse. What she needed was someone who understood suffering, someone who had survived their own darkness and could recognize it in a child's eyes. You need a woman who has known loss, the doctor had said over brandy in Thomas's study. Not some cheerful girl who will try to jolly Caroline out of her grief. You need someone who can sit with pain without trying to fix it. Someone patient enough to wait for trust rather than demand it. And, Thomas, I hate to say this, but you might find that person more easily among your slaves than among white society. They know suffering in ways we never will. The words had made Thomas uncomfortable. He had inherited his plantation and his 37 slaves from his father. He treated them well by the standards of the day, or so he told himself. They were fed adequately, housed reasonably, not beaten without cause. He never separated families if he could avoid it. He considered himself a decent master, but he had never thought of his slaves as having inner lives complex enough to include the kind of emotional depth Dr. Price was describing. Still, he was desperate. And so here he stood in Richmond's largest slave market on a grey October morning, looking for a woman who could reach his unreachable daughter. The market smelled of unwashed bodies and fear and tobacco and the river. Hundreds of people packed into pens and onto platforms, their faces blank with the resignation of those who had learned that showing emotion only made things worse. Thomas walked slowly past the rows of women, feeling their eyes on him, seeing the way some straightened their postures, hoping to be chosen, hoping their next master might be kinder than the last. He saw young women, old women, strong women built for field work, delicate women suited for house service. He saw mothers clutching children who would like to be sold separately. He saw defiance in some faces and absolute brokenness in others. And then he saw Ruth. She stood apart from the others in a way that had nothing to do with physical distance. Mid-30s, he guessed, with dark skin and grey threading through the hair that she wore wrapped in a faded red cloth. Tall and thin, almost gaunt, with hands that looked too large for her wrists and eyes that looked too old for her face. But it was not her appearance that caught his attention. It was her stillness. While other women shifted nervously or tried to make themselves appealing to potential buyers, Ruth stood perfectly motionless, staring at nothing, present in body but absent in spirit. She looked like someone who had already died inside and was just waiting for her body to catch up. Thomas had seen that look before, on soldiers who had survived battles that destroyed their souls, on his wife in the weeks before she drowned, when depression had hollowed her out from the inside. "How much for that one?" he asked the trader, a thin man named Gibson, who was known for trafficking in what he called quality merchandise. "That's Ruth," Gibson said, following Thomas's gaze. "Had her about 2 months now. Got her from an estate sale down in North Carolina. Previous owner died and the widow sold off the whole lot." He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "I'll be straight with you, sir. He's damaged goods, lost her own children about 3 years back. All 4 of them. Scarlet fever took 3. The youngest died in some kind of accident. She's been trouble ever since. Won't talk much, won't smile, does her work, but with no spirit in it. I'm letting her go cheap, because honestly, she depresses the other merchandise." Thomas felt something shift in his chest. 4 children. This woman had lost 4 children, and she was still standing, still breathing, still somehow moving through the world, even though everything that mattered had been ripped away from her. "I will take her," he said. Gibson blinked in surprise. "Sir, I have other women who would serve you better, younger, prettier, more cooperative. Ruth here is likely to be more trouble than she's worth. I said I will take her. Name your price." They settled on $300, a fraction of what a prime field hand would cost. Gibson drew up the papers, and within an hour Ruth belonged to Thomas Whitmore. Or, rather, her body did. Her soul clearly belonged to whatever ghosts haunted her. During the carriage ride back to Whitmore Plantation, Thomas explained the situation. Ruth sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on something beyond the window. She did not react as he described Caroline's condition, did not ask questions, did not even acknowledge that she heard him. She simply sat in that terrible stillness, and Thomas began to wonder if he had made a catastrophic mistake. "My daughter needs someone who understands what she is going through," he said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. "Dr. Price thinks that someone who has experienced profound loss might be able to help her in ways that others cannot. I know you have suffered. I know you have lost children. I am asking you to use that suffering to help my child. Will you do that?" For the first time, Ruth's eyes moved to his face. They were completely empty. No hope, no anger, no grief, no anything. Just vast, terrible emptiness. "Yes, master," she said. Her voice was flat and mechanical, the voice of someone who had learned to say whatever would keep them safe. The plantation appeared as they crested the hill, 200 acres of tobacco fields, now mostly harvested for the season, with the processing barns standing dark against the autumn sky. The main house was a modest 2-story structure, nothing like the grand mansions that lined the James River, but solid and well-maintained. Slave quarters lined the far edge of the property, small cabins that housed the families who worked Thomas's land. Thomas's overseer, Jacob Fletcher, met them at the house. He was a hard man, Fletcher, but not cruel by the standards of the time. He nodded at Ruth without much interest. "Put her in the empty cabin by the oak tree," Thomas said. "And Fletcher, she is not to work the fields. She is here solely to care for my daughter. Make sure everyone understands that." Fletcher's eyebrows rose. "A house slave, then?" "Not exactly. She is Caroline's nurse. She answers directly to me. No one else is to give her orders or interfere with her duties. Is that clear?" "Clear as crystal, sir." Fletcher looked at Ruth with more interest now. "Though I hope you know what you are doing. The girl's in a bad way, and I am not sure a slave is the answer." "Neither am I," Thomas admitted. "But I am out of other options." Ruth was installed in a small cabin that had previously housed an elderly slave who died the year before. It was simple but private, with a bed, a chair, a small table, and a fireplace. Better quarters than most slaves could hope for. Thomas gave her an hour to settle in, then brought her to the main house to meet Caroline. His daughter's room was on the second floor at the back of the house with windows overlooking the tobacco fields. Caroline sat in a rocking chair by the window, dressed in a white nightgown despite it being mid-afternoon, staring out at nothing. She did not turn when they entered, did not acknowledge their presence at all. She looked like a porcelain doll, Thomas thought, with an ache in his chest. Perfect and beautiful and completely lifeless. Her blonde hair hung in tangles as the maids had stopped trying to brush because Caroline fought them so violently. Her skin had the translucent quality of someone who never went outside. Her hands were curled into small fists in her lap. "Caroline," Thomas said gently, "sweetheart, I have brought someone to take care of you. Her name is Ruth. She's going to stay with you and help you feel better." No response, not even a flicker of recognition. Ruth moved forward slowly, making no sudden movements. She pulled a low stool close to Caroline's chair and sat down, bringing herself to the child's eye level. For a long moment she simply sat there, not speaking, not touching, just being present. Then Ruth did something strange. She began to hum. It was not a cheerful tune or a lullaby. It was something low and mournful, almost a dirge, a melody that spoke of loss and endurance and the terrible weight of continuing to live when everything worth living for was gone. Caroline's eyes flickered. Just for a second her gaze shifted from the window to Ruth's face. Thomas held his breath. Ruth kept humming that sad and terrible song, and slowly, so slowly that Thomas almost missed it, Caroline's hands began to uncurve from their fists. Her breathing changed, becoming less shallow. A single tear rolled down her cheek. They sat like that for nearly an hour. Ruth humming, Caroline slowly, incrementally softening. When the sun began to set, Ruth finally spoke. "Your mama drowned," she said simply. "Mine died too. Different way, but just as gone. Being gone is being gone. Does not matter how they left. What matters is they are not here, and we are, and we do not know how to be in a world without them." Caroline's head turned fully toward Ruth now. Her eyes were wide and wet with unshed tears. "People will tell you it gets better," Ruth continued in that same flat, honest voice. "They will tell you time heals all wounds. They will tell you to be brave, to move on, to remember the happy times. And you will want to scream at them because they do not understand. Time does not heal this kind of wound. It just teaches you how to carry it. And brave does not mean not being sad. Brave means getting up each day even though everything inside you wants to stay in bed forever." Thomas stood frozen by the door, barely breathing, watching his daughter's face come alive for the first time in 8 months. "I lost 4 children," Ruth said, and now her voice cracked just slightly, the first hint of emotion breaking through that terrible flatness. "4 babies that I carried and nursed and loved, all gone. And some days I wish I was gone too. Some days I wake up and I cannot remember why I am supposed to keep living. Do you feel like that?" Caroline nodded, one small, jerky movement of her head. "It is all right to feel like that," Ruth said. "It does not make you bad or weak or wrong. It makes you someone who loved deeply and lost hard. That is all. That is enough." And then Caroline did something that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. She reached out one small hand and placed it on Ruth's knee. Just rested it there, the first time she had willingly touched another person since her mother died. Ruth looked down at that small white hand on her dark knee. Something shifted in her face, some infinitesimal movement in the muscles around her eyes and mouth. Not quite warmth, but perhaps the memory of warmth, the ghost of what warmth might feel like. "I cannot promise to make you happy," Ruth said quietly. "I cannot promise to fix you or heal you or make the sadness go away, but I promise to sit with you in it. I promise not to lie to you and tell you everything is fine when it is not. I promise to be here even when here is a terrible place to be. Is that enough?" Caroline's hand squeezed Ruth's knee. Once, gently, Thomas quietly left the room, his vision blurred with tears. He walked down the hallway to his own bedroom, closed the door, and for the first time since his wife died, allowed himself to cry. Not because his daughter was cured, she was not, but because for the first time in 8 months she had connected with another human being. She had reached out instead of pulling away. There was hope in that, fragile and tentative but real. Over the next weeks, Ruth and Caroline developed a strange, silent routine. Ruth moved into the house, sleeping on a pallet on the floor of Caroline's room. She did not try to force the child to eat or sleep or speak. She simply existed alongside her, a steady presence that asked for nothing and offered only brutal honesty about pain. They would sit together by the window for hours, Ruth humming her mournful songs while Caroline rocked in her chair. Sometimes Ruth would tell stories about her own children, not happy stories about their births or first words, but hard stories about watching them die, about the specific pain of losing each one, about the guilt of surviving when they did not. These were not the kinds of stories anyone tells children, but Caroline was not a normal child, and Ruth seemed to understand that normal comfort was useless to her. What Caroline needed was permission to feel the full depth of her grief without anyone trying to minimize it or rush her through it. Slowly, incrementally, Caroline began to eat more. Ruth would put food in front of her and say, "Your body needs fuel even if your heart does not care about living, so we eat. Not because we want to, but because staying alive is what we do." And Caroline would eat, mechanically, joylessly, but she would eat. She began to sleep better, too. The nightmares did not stop, but when Caroline woke screaming, Ruth would be there, not shushing her or telling her it was just a dream, but sitting with her in the darkness and saying, I know the dreams where they are still alive, and then you wake up and remember they are not. I know how that feels." Thomas watched all this from a distance, grateful and disturbed, in equal measure. He had never heard anyone speak to a child the way Ruth spoke to Caroline. There was no false cheerfulness, no protective lying, no attempt to shield Caroline from the harsh realities of death and grief. Ruth treated her like an adult, like someone capable of handling truth, even when truth was unbearable. But it was working. His daughter was coming back to life, slowly, painfully, but unmistakably. Then came the night that changed everything. It was mid-November, about 6 weeks after Ruth's arrival. Thomas had been working late in his study, going over accounts, when he realized it was past midnight. The house was dark and silent. He stood to retire to bed when he heard it. A voice. Singing. He froze. Caroline's voice. His daughter was singing. Thomas moved through the dark hallway like a man in a dream, drawn toward the sound. It was coming from Caroline's room. He approached the door, which stood slightly ajar, and peered through the gap. What he saw stopped his heart. Ruth sat on the floor with Caroline in her lap, the child's head resting against her chest. But that was not what made Thomas's blood run cold. It was what they were doing. Ruth held a small, leather-bound book in one hand, her finger tracing under words while Caroline sang them. Slowly, haltingly, but unmistakably, his daughter was reading words and singing them in a voice that grew stronger with each line. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. The song was a slave spiritual. Thomas recognized it from hearing his field worker sing it during harvest. But hearing it from his daughter's lips, seeing Ruth teaching her to read the words from a forbidden book, watching them swaying together in the lamplight like this was the most natural thing in the world. He felt reality tilt sideways. Teaching slaves to read was illegal in Virginia. Had been since 1831 after Nat Turner's rebellion. The penalty was severe. Whipping for the slave, heavy fines or imprisonment for any white person who allowed it. And here was Ruth not just reading herself, but teaching his daughter, creating evidence of a crime in his own house. Thomas should have burst in immediately, should have seized the book, punished Ruth, put an end to this dangerous violation. But he stood paralyzed, watching his daughter's face. Caroline was smiling. Actually smiling, her eyes bright with concentration as she struggled to sound out the next word. Ruth guided her finger along the page, patient and gentle, murmuring encouragement. "That word is Jordan," Ruth said softly, "like the river in the Bible. Can you say it?" "Jordan," Caroline whispered, her voice scratchy from months of disuse but clear. "Jordan, good girl. And this one here?" Caroline frowned, concentrating. "H-O-M-E, home. Yes, baby, home. The place we all want to reach. The place where pain ends and peace begins. Is that where Mama is?" Caroline asked, her child's voice so small and fragile. "In home?" Ruth was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "I believe so. I believe that is where my babies are too. All of them waiting in home, where the chariot will carry us someday when our time comes." "I want to go to home," Caroline said. "I want to see Mama." "I know you do," Ruth replied, her arms tightening around the child. But your time is not yet. You have to stay here a while longer. Learn to read all these words. Learn to sing all these songs. Grow up big and strong. And then, when you are old and have lived a full life, the chariot will come for you too. But not today, not for many, many years. But I miss her, Caroline said, and tears began streaming down her face. I miss her so much it hurts inside my chest. I know, baby, I know exactly how that feels. Missing someone is like carrying a stone in your heart. Some days the stone feels light. Some days it feels so heavy you cannot breathe. But you keep carrying it because that stone is made of love. And love does not die just because people do. We carry their love inside us forever. Thomas felt tears on his own cheeks. He had never heard grief explained so perfectly, so truthfully. This slave woman with no formal education understood the human heart better than any preacher or doctor he had ever consulted. "Will you teach me more words?" Caroline asked, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. "I want to read about home and chariots and angels." "Every night," Ruth promised, "as long as your papa does not find out and send me away." Caroline's eyes widened with fear. "Would he do that?" "I do not know, baby. White folks get scared when slaves can read. They think it makes us dangerous. They think words give us ideas about freedom and equality, and things they do not want us thinking about. So, this has to be our secret. Just yours and mine. Can you keep a secret?" "Yes," Caroline said firmly. "I will never tell. Never ever." "Good girl. Now let us practice this song one more time before sleep." They began singing together, Caroline's thin voice blending with Ruth's deeper one, the melody filling the room with sorrow and hope intertwined. Thomas backed away from the door silently, his mind racing. He should stop this. He knew he should, but something in him rebelled against the thought. His daughter was reading, smiling, engaging with the world again. Ruth had accomplished in 6 weeks what doctors and governesses and prayer had failed to do in 8 months. How could he destroy that? How could he punish the woman who had given him back his daughter? But the law was clear. And if anyone found out, if Caroline accidentally revealed what Ruth was teaching her, if a visiting relative overheard that spiritual song and asked questions, the consequences would be devastating. Ruth would be sold away, probably to the deep south where reading slaves were punished with extraordinary cruelty. Caroline would lose another person she loved, another attachment violently severed. And Thomas himself could face criminal charges, could lose his standing in the community, could see his plantation and everything he had worked for destroyed. He walked downstairs to his study and poured himself a brandy with shaking hands, then another. He sat in his father's leather chair and tried to think clearly through the fog of fear and wonder. The practical choice was obvious. Confront Ruth tomorrow, take away whatever books she had smuggled into the house, forbid her from teaching Caroline anything beyond basic care. Perhaps reassign her to fieldwork and hire a proper white governess, now that Caroline was improving. That was the safe choice, the legal choice, the choice any reasonable plantation owner would make. But Thomas had spent his entire life making practical choices, marrying the woman his family approved of, rather than the one he loved, running the plantation the way his father had, never questioning the system he inherited, maintaining respectability and status and all the things that mattered in Virginia society. And where had it gotten him? His wife drowned, possibly on purpose, his daughter traumatized into silence, his life a performance of propriety with no real happiness underneath. What if for once he made the impractical choice? What if he let Ruth continue teaching Caroline, not openly, but in secret, with proper precautions? What if he chose his daughter's well-being over the law? The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Thomas did not sleep that night. He sat in his study until dawn, wrestling with his conscience and his fear. By the time the sun rose, he had made his decision. Right or wrong, legal or illegal, he would allow this to continue. But he needed to speak with Ruth first, needed to understand what he was really dealing with. He waited until mid-morning, after Caroline had eaten breakfast and was napping. Then he summoned Ruth to his study. She came quietly, her face showing no emotion, no fear, nothing, but he noticed her hands were clenched at her sides. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Ruth hesitated. Slaves did not sit in their master's presence. It was a violation of the social order, a presumption of equality that could be punished. Please, Thomas added, sit. She sat on the very edge of the chair, her spine rigid, ready to bolt if necessary. I saw you last night, Thomas said without preamble, teaching Caroline to read. Using a book that I assume you can read yourself, I heard you both singing slave spirituals together. I watched my daughter smile for the first time in 8 months. Now I need you to explain to me how a slave from North Carolina knows how to read well enough to teach a child. Ruth's face remained impassive, but her hands tightened into fists. Will you sell me, master? That depends on what you tell me. The truth, Ruth. All of it. How did you learn to read? For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, in that flat, mechanical voice, she began to speak. My first master was a Quaker, she said, in Pennsylvania, before I was sold south. He did not believe in slavery, but he inherited slaves from his father, and the law would not let him free us without posting bond money he did not have, so he kept us, but he educated us. Said every human being deserved to read the Bible for themselves. Taught all his slaves to read and write and do arithmetic. When I was 15, he died, and his son sold us all to settle debts. I went to a plantation in Maryland, then to another in North Carolina. Each time I hid what I knew, because educated slaves get sold to the Deep South, or worse. I learned to act simple, to pretend I could not read the work orders or the signs in town. I survived by hiding. And the books? Where did you get books? I stole them, she said bluntly. Over the years, from houses I worked in, I would take one book at a time, small ones that would not be missed, hide them in my cabin, read them at night, by firelight when everyone else was asleep. I have maybe 20 books hidden in my cabin now. Most are religious books, some are poetry. One is a geography book with maps of places I will never see. Thomas leaned back in his chair, stunned. You have been stealing books for years, building a secret library, teaching yourself while pretending to be illiterate. Yes, master. Why? What possible good does it do you? Reading cannot change your circumstances. It cannot make you free. For the first time, emotion flickered across Ruth's face. A flash of anger, quickly suppressed. No, it cannot make me free, but it makes me human. When I read, I am not a slave. I am a mind engaging with other minds across time and distance. I am equal to any person who has ever read those same words. For a few hours each night, I belong to myself. That is worth the risk. The fierce dignity in her voice made Thomas's chest tight. And Caroline, why teach her? Because she needed it, Ruth said simply. That child is drowning in grief and silence. She needed a way to express what she cannot say out loud. Songs and stories give her words for feelings she does not understand yet. Reading gives her power over her own mind. And she learned my secret the third night I was here. She woke from a nightmare and saw me reading by candlelight. I expected her to tell you immediately, but she did not. She asked what I was doing. I showed her the book. She asked me to teach her, so I did. You realize what you have done is illegal, Thomas said. What we are all doing by continuing this is illegal. If anyone finds out, you will be sold, or worse. I could face criminal charges. Caroline could be taken from me by authorities who decide I am unfit. I know, master. Ruth met his eyes steadily. So what will you do? Thomas stood and walked to the window, looking out at his tobacco fields where slaves were working under Fletcher's supervision. His entire world was built on their labor, on the legal fiction that these people were property rather than persons. He had never questioned it before, never allowed himself to think too deeply about what it meant to own other human beings. But Ruth had forced him to see what he had been avoiding. These were not simple creatures content with their servitude. They were people with inner lives as complex as his own. People who stole books and read in secret and carried unbearable grief and loved their children with the same fierce devotion he felt for Caroline. People who deserved freedom and dignity and the right to develop their own minds. The system he had inherited and maintained was monstrous. He saw that clearly now, and he was complicit in its monstrosity. I will allow you to continue teaching Caroline, he said slowly, still looking out the window, but with conditions. You will be extremely careful. No books left where they can be found. No reading during the day when servants might walk in unexpectedly. No teaching Caroline anything she might accidentally reveal to visitors. Do you understand? Yes, master, Ruth said, and he heard surprise in her voice. And Ruth, he turned to face her. I want you to teach me too. Her eyes widened. Teach you what, master? You already know how to read. Teach me what you know about being human, about grief and survival and maintaining dignity in impossible circumstances. Teach me to see the world the way you see it, because I think I have been blind my entire life, and I am tired of not seeing. Ruth stared at him for a long moment. Then, incredibly, she smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and fragile, but it transformed her face. For just a second, he glimpsed the woman she must have been before loss and slavery, hollowed her out. I can do that, master, she said quietly. And please, when we are alone like this, call me Thomas. Master is a title I am beginning to hate. Her smile widened slightly. That might take some getting used to, Thomas. Over the following months, an extraordinary relationship developed between Thomas, Ruth, and Caroline. To the outside world, everything appeared normal. Ruth was simply the nurse who had successfully brought the Whitmore daughter out of her grief. She was quiet, obedient, unremarkable. No one suspected anything unusual. But in the private hours of evening and night, something revolutionary was happening in that house. Ruth taught Caroline to read with systematic skill. They worked through primers and simple stories, then graduated to more complex texts. Caroline proved to be a gifted student, hungry for knowledge, devouring every book Ruth provided. But more than literacy, Ruth taught her empathy. She told Caroline stories about slave life, about families separated, about the daily humiliations and cruelties and small resistances. She taught her that the people who worked in the fields and the kitchens were not property, but human beings with hopes and fears and dreams. And she taught Thomas too, though his education was more subtle. She would ask him questions that forced him to think about things he had always taken for granted. Questions like, if you believe all men are created equal, like it says in the Declaration, how do you justify owning people? Or if someone stole your freedom and forced you to work without pay, would you consider them a good master if they fed you adequately and did not beat you too often? These conversations happened late at night in Thomas's study, after Caroline was asleep. Ruth would report on the child's progress, and then they would talk. Really talk with an honesty that crossed every boundary of race and status. Thomas found himself telling her things he had never told anyone. About his unhappy marriage, his wife's depression, his own doubts about the life he was living. My wife used to sit by the river for hours, he told Ruth one night, just staring at the water. I knew she was unhappy, but I did not know what to do about it. I thought if I gave her a better house, nicer things, more servants, she would feel better. But things do not heal sadness, do they? No, Ruth said. Sadness needs to be heard and held, not buried under things. Did you ever ask her what she was sad about? I was afraid of the answer, Thomas admitted. Afraid she would say she was sad because of me, because our marriage was a business arrangement that satisfied our families but left both of us lonely, so I never asked. And then one day she walked into the river and did not come back out. Ruth was quiet for a moment. My husband was sold away from me, she said finally. We had been together 10 years, had 4 children together. And one morning the master decided he needed cash more than he needed another field hand. So my husband went to auction, and I never saw him again. I did not get to say goodbye, did not get to tell him I loved him one more time. He is probably dead by now, or remarried to someone else, starting a new family, because what choice did he have? Either way, he is gone. That kind of powerlessness, that kind of loss, it breaks something inside you that never fully heals. I am sorry, Thomas said. It was inadequate, but it was all he had. Are you sorry enough to free your slaves? Ruth asked bluntly. Sorry enough to let them choose their own paths? The question hit him like a physical blow. I have thought about it, he admitted. But the economics, the social consequences, the legal complications, all reasons that matter more than their freedom, Ruth finished for him. I understand. It is easier to be sorry than to act on that sorrow. Thomas had no response to that. She was right. He was complicit. Even as he educated himself about the evils of slavery, even as he developed genuine affection for Ruth and appreciation for her wisdom, he continued to profit from owning human beings. He told himself he was a good master, that his slaves were better off with him than they would be with someone crueler. But these were just comfortable lies he told himself to sleep at night. The winter passed into spring. Caroline bloomed like the dogwood trees around the plantation. She was reading at a level far beyond her age, devouring everything Ruth gave her. She taught constantly now, asking endless questions about the world. She had gained weight and color. Her nightmares had mostly stopped. She laughed and played and lived again. And she adored Ruth with a fierceness that sometimes worried Thomas. When he suggested that Caroline might benefit from the company of other white children her age, she refused absolutely. She wanted only Ruth. When he mentioned that eventually Caroline would need proper schooling with other girls of her class, she cried for hours. "Ruth is my family now," Caroline insisted. "She is my teacher and my friend, and I love her. I do not need anyone else." Thomas understood his daughter's attachment, but it troubled him. Caroline was growing up with none of the racial prejudices that defined Southern society. She saw Ruth as simply Ruth, a person she loved, without any awareness of the supposedly fundamental differences that justified slavery. In one sense, this was beautiful. In another sense, it was dangerous. Caroline would eventually have to navigate a world that would punish her for such colorblindness. He tried to explain this to Ruth one night. "She's going to face such difficulty," he said, "when she is older and realizes that what we have here is not normal, when she sees how other white children treat slaves, when she has to choose between the values we have taught her and the society she lives in. Then she will choose," Ruth said calmly, "and the choice she makes will tell her who she is." You cannot protect her from that, Thomas. You can only give her the tools to choose wisely. What if she chooses wrong? What if the pressure of society makes her abandon everything we have taught her? Then you will have failed her. But I do not think you will. That child has steel in her spine. She will be brave when the time comes. How can you be so certain? Because she learned grief from me, Ruth said, and grief teaches you what matters. Everything else is just noise. In May, Thomas received a letter from his brother-in-law in Richmond, informing him that there would be a family gathering in July for his mother-in-law's birthday. All the extended family would be there. Caroline's attendance was expected. Thomas's stomach sank as he read the letter. This would be the first time Caroline would be in society since her mother's death, the first time she would interact with other white children of her class. And it would be the first real test of whether the education Ruth had given her would help or harm her. He showed the letter to Ruth that evening. "I cannot avoid this," he said. "My wife's family has been patient about Caroline's condition, but if I refuse to bring her to this gathering, they will become suspicious. They might even insist on visiting here to check on her well-being." "Then you must go," Ruth said, "and prepare Caroline for what she will encounter." "How do I prepare her to see other children mistreating slaves? How do I prepare her to stay silent when she sees injustice?" "The same way I prepared my own children," Ruth said quietly. "You teach her that surviving requires strategy, that she can hold her values in her heart without announcing them to everyone, that being smart is different from being complicit, that sometimes you have to hide your true self to live in a world that would destroy you if it knew what you really thought." "It sounds like teaching her to be a hypocrite." "It sounds like teaching her to survive," Ruth corrected. "There is a difference between hiding who you are because you are ashamed, and hiding who you are because the world is ashamed, and hiding who you are because the world is not safe for you yet. I hide my literacy not because I think there is anything wrong with reading, but because the world would punish me for it. Caroline will learn to hide her enlightenment for the same reason, until she is old enough and powerful enough to change that world rather than just survive in it." Thomas hoped she was right. He spent the next weeks preparing Caroline for the Richmond visit, explaining that not everyone saw the world the way they did, that she must be careful what she said around her grandmother and cousins, that some things were private family matters. Caroline listened solemnly. "Will Ruth come with us?" she asked. "No, sweetheart. Ruth will stay here and care for the plantation while we are gone." Terror flashed across Caroline's face. "But what if something happens to her while we are away? What if you sell her, or someone takes her, or she gets sick?" "Nothing will happen to her," Thomas promised. "I give you my word. Ruth will be here when we return." "Promise?" Caroline demanded. "Promise on Mama's grave?" The oath was sacred to her. Thomas took her small hands in his. "I promise on your mama's grave. Ruth is part of our family now. She is not going anywhere." But even as he said the words, a cold dread settled in his stomach, because he knew that in the world they lived in, such promises were fragile things. One financial crisis, one change in law, one accusation from a suspicious neighbor, and Ruth could be torn from their lives as easily as Caroline's mother had been torn away by the river. The gathering in Richmond was exactly as Thomas feared. His mother-in-law's estate was a massive brick mansion overlooking the James River, surrounded by manicured gardens and supported by nearly 100 slaves. Thomas's wife had grown up in this house, in this world of casual wealth and unquestioned privilege. No wonder she had felt trapped. No wonder the river had called to her. Caroline clung to Thomas's hand as they entered the grand foyer, where family members were gathering. His mother-in-law, Margaret Preston, descended upon them immediately. She was a formidable woman in her 60s, dressed in expensive black silk, her face a mask of genteel disapproval. "Thomas," she said, kissing the air near his cheek, and "little Caroline, my dear child, let me look at you." She gripped Caroline's chin and tilted her face upward, examining her like livestock. "The child has color in her cheeks again. You said she had been ill." "She looks perfectly healthy to me. She has recovered," Thomas said carefully, "with proper care. From that slave nurse you hired, I understand." Margaret's tone made clear what she thought of that decision. "Well, I suppose whatever works, though I still say a proper white governess would have been more appropriate. You know how slaves can fill children's heads with superstitions and nonsense." Caroline's hand tightened on Thomas's, but she said nothing. "Good girl," he thought. "Stay quiet, stay safe." The afternoon was torture. Caroline was surrounded by cousins she barely remembered, children who had been raised with all the casual cruelty of their class. Thomas watched in growing horror as these well-dressed children ordered slave children around like dogs, struck them casually for minor infractions, spoke about them as if they were furniture. One cousin, a boy of about 10 named Robert, kicked a young slave boy who had not moved quickly enough to retrieve his ball. The slave child, maybe 7 years old, stumbled and fell but did not cry out, just picked himself up and fetched the ball with his head down. Caroline went rigid beside Thomas. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tight together. He put a warning hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him with eyes full of fury and helplessness, but she stayed silent. Later, during tea in the garden, the adult women discussed household management with the casual brutality that came naturally to them. Thomas's sister-in-law, Catherine, complained that her cook had burned the roast and needed a good whipping to remind her to be more careful. "Though, honestly," Catherine sighed, delicately sipping her tea, "I find whipping to be so tiresome, all that screaming and carrying on. I have started simply selling off any slave who cannot perform adequately. It is much cleaner and serves as an excellent lesson to the others." "Quite right," Margaret agreed. "One cannot be too soft with them or they become unmanageable. I always say a firm hand and clear consequences are essential to running a proper household." Thomas felt Caroline trembling beside him. He placed his hand on her knee under the table, a silent message. "Soon, sweetheart. We will leave soon." But the worst moment came that evening during supper. The children were seated at a separate table in the dining room, attended by slave children who stood behind their chairs ready to serve. Thomas sat with the adults but positioned himself where he could see Caroline. She was doing well, maintaining the polite silence expected of children in adult company, eating her food carefully. Then Robert, the same cousin who had kicked the slave boy earlier, decided to amuse himself and the other children. "Watch this," he said loudly enough for the adults to hear. He turned to the slave child standing behind his chair, a girl of perhaps 8 with her hair in tight braids. "You, girl, what is your name?" The child kept her eyes down. "Daisy, sir." "Daisy," Robert said mockingly. "What a pretty name for such an ugly creature. Tell me, Daisy, can you read?" The child looked terrified. "No, sir. It is against the law, sir." "That is right, because reading is for people, not animals. And you are an animal, are you not? Say it. Say, 'I am an animal.'" The adults were watching now, some amused, some indifferent. No one intervened. This was considered normal, even educational, teaching children their place in the social order. The slave girl whispered, "I am an animal, sir." Caroline stood up so abruptly her chair scraped against the floor. The entire room went silent. She was shaking, her small fists clenched at her sides, tears streaming down her face. "She is not an animal," Caroline said, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "She is a person. She has a name and feelings, and she deserves respect. You are cruel and horrible, and I hate you." The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas felt ice flood his veins. "Carolyn Ann Whitmore," Margaret's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Sit down this instant. Apologize to your cousin." "No," Caroline said, and Thomas saw that Ruth had been right about the steel in his daughter's spine. "I will not apologize for telling the truth. Slaves are people. They feel pain and love and sadness just like us. They should not be kicked or hit or called animals, and anyone who does those things is wrong. Wrong and cruel, and I do not care what the law says." Thomas stood and moved to his daughter, but Margaret was faster. She crossed the room and grabbed Caroline's arm hard enough to leave marks. "You insolent child," she hissed. "I see what that slave nurse has taught you, filling your head with abolitionist poison. Thomas, I insist you dismiss that woman immediately. She is ruining your daughter." "Let her go," Thomas said quietly, but with steel in his own voice now. "You are hurting her." "She needs to be hurt," Margaret snapped. "She needs to learn her place and proper thinking. This is what comes of allowing a slave to raise a white child. This is what happens when you are too weak to maintain discipline." Thomas moved forward and carefully but firmly removed Caroline from his mother-in-law's grip. He lifted his daughter into his arms. She buried her face against his neck, sobbing. "We are leaving," he said. "Now." "If you walk out that door," Margaret said, her face flushed with rage, "you are no longer welcome in this family. I will make certain everyone in Richmond society knows that you are raising your daughter to be a race traitor and a social pariah. Your business relationships will suffer. Your reputation will be destroyed." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, then at the other family members watching with expressions ranging from shock to disgust, in a few faces, grudging admiration. "Then so be it," he said. "I would rather be a pariah with integrity than welcomed into a society built on cruelty." He carried Caroline out of that house and into the carriage. They left immediately, not even staying the night. As Richmond disappeared behind them in the darkness, Caroline cried against his chest. "I am sorry, Papa," she sobbed. "I know I was supposed to stay quiet. I know I was supposed to pretend. But I could not. I could not watch them hurt that little girl and say nothing. Ruth says that silence in the face of injustice is the same as approval. She says that when we see wrong being done and we do nothing, we become wrong too." Thomas held his daughter close, his heart breaking and swelling at the same time. "You did the right thing, sweetheart. You were brave and truthful, and I am proud of you. So proud. But grandmother said terrible things. She said you will lose your business and your friends and everyone will hate us. Then we will find new friends," Thomas said. "Better friends. People who believe that all humans deserve dignity and respect. We will build a different kind of life. Can Ruth stay with us? That is all I care about. Can she stay?" "Yes," Thomas promised. "Ruth stays. Always." But when they arrived home 3 days later, Ruth was gone. Thomas knew something was wrong the moment the carriage pulled up to the house. Fetcher was waiting on the porch, his face grim. Several of the house slaves were crying openly, and Ruth's cabin door stood open, emptied of all her belongings. "What happened?" Thomas demanded, leaping from the carriage. "Where is Ruth?" Fletcher looked uncomfortable. "Your mother-in-law sent men, sir, her overseer and 2 slave catchers. They arrived yesterday with legal papers claiming that Ruth had been teaching Miss Caroline illegal subjects and filling her head with seditious ideas. They said Mrs. Preston had evidence that Ruth could read and write, that she was a dangerous influence. They had a warrant for her arrest and authorization to remove her from the property pending investigation." Thomas felt the world spin. No, I have her purchase papers. She is my property legally. They cannot just take her. They can if there is suspicion of illegal activity, sir. Reading is a crime. Teaching reading is a crime. They took her to Richmond to be examined by a magistrate. If she is found guilty, she will be sold south, probably to the cotton fields in Mississippi or Alabama. That is what they do with educated slaves, send them where the work is hard enough to break their spirit. Caroline screamed, a sound of pure anguish that tore from her throat like something dying. She ran from the carriage toward Ruth's empty cabin, Thomas chasing after her. She threw herself on the floor of that bare room and wailed, a sound eerily similar to the wordless grief she had expressed when her mother died. This was Thomas's fault. He had known the risks and taken them anyway. He had promised Caroline that Ruth would be safe, that nothing would happen to her. And his own arrogance, his belief that he could protect them from the consequences of their choices, had led to this. He knelt beside his daughter and tried to hold her, but she fought him, hitting his chest with small fists. "You promised," she screamed. "You promised she would be here. You lied to me. You let them take her, just like the river took Mama. Everyone I love gets taken away." "I will get her back," Thomas said desperately. "I swear to you, Caroline. I will go to Richmond. I will find her. I will bring her home." But even as he said it, he knew how difficult that would be. His mother-in-law was one of the wealthiest, most powerful women in Virginia. She had connections to judges, politicians, slave traders. If she wanted Ruth sold south, Ruth would be sold south. Legal technicalities would not stop her. Still, he had to try. Thomas left Fletcher in charge of the plantation and rode for Richmond that very night, pushing his horse hard through the darkness. He arrived at dawn and went straight to the courthouse where he knew magistrate hearings were held. The clerk informed him that Ruth's case had already been heard the previous afternoon. She had been found guilty of literacy, of teaching a white child unauthorized subjects, and of possessing forbidden materials. The sentence was sail to the deep south. She would be transported to New Orleans within the week to be auctioned to cotton plantation owners. "I want to see her," Thomas demanded. "I am her legal owner. I have the right to see my own property." The clerk shrugged. "She is being held in the slave pens near the docks. You can try there." The slave pens were a nightmare that Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. Row upon row of cages, holding men, women, and children waiting to be shipped south to fates that most did not survive more than a few years. The smell of human waste and fear was overwhelming. The sounds of crying and praying filled the air. He found Ruth in a cage with 20 other women, all of them shackled. She sat in the corner, her eyes closed, her lips moving in silent prayer, or perhaps reciting poetry from those stolen books she would never see again. When she heard his voice calling her name, her eyes opened. "Thomas," she said, and there was no surprise in her voice, just resignation. "I knew you would come." He gripped the bars of the cage, his knuckles white. "I'm going to get you out of this. I will pay whatever fine they demand. I will hire lawyers. I will fight this in court." Ruth shook her head slowly. "You cannot fight this. Your mother-in-law has made sure of that. She wants me gone, and she has the power to make it happen. You need to accept that and focus on protecting Caroline." "I cannot accept it," Thomas said fiercely. "You saved my daughter's life. You saved my daughter's life. You saved mine too, in a different way. I will not abandon you to this." "You must," Ruth said gently, "because fighting for me will destroy you and Caroline both. Your mother-in-law has already spread word through Richmond that you are an abolitionist sympathizer, that you allow slaves to corrupt your daughter. If you make a public spectacle of trying to save me, it will only confirm those accusations. You will lose everything, and Caroline needs you. She cannot lose both of us." "I promised her I would bring you back." "Then you will have to break that promise," Ruth said, and for the first time her voice cracked with emotion. "You will have to explain to her that sometimes love is not enough, that sometimes the world is too cruel and too powerful, that sometimes all we can do is survive and remember and carry each other in our hearts." Thomas felt tears streaming down his face, not caring who saw. "There has to be another way." "There is," Ruth said quietly. "Set your other slaves free, all of them. Use the money you would spend fighting for me to purchase their freedom instead. Let them choose their own paths. Give them what I will never have. Do that, and my teaching Caroline will have meant something. Do that, and this will not have been for nothing." "I will free them and fight for you," Thomas said. "I can do both." "No, you cannot. Not with your mother-in-law working against you. She has too much power. But you can do this one good thing. You can dismantle the evil you inherited from your father. You can give those 37 souls their humanity back. Please, Thomas, do this for me. Let my legacy be their freedom." Before Thomas could respond, a guard approached. "Time is up," he said gruffly. "Move along." Thomas looked at Ruth one last time, trying to memorize her face. "I love you," he said, "not as property, not as a servant, as a person, as someone who changed my entire understanding of the world." "I know," Ruth said softly. "I love you too, and Caroline, tell her I love her, and I am proud of her for speaking truth in that dining room. Tell her to keep that courage. Tell her to use the education I gave her to make the world better. Tell her that freedom is not just about breaking chains, but about breaking the thinking that made the chains seem acceptable in the first place." "I will tell her," Thomas promised. "I will make sure she never forgets you or what you taught us." "Then go," Ruth said, her voice breaking. "Go and do what I asked. Free them, all of them, and live a life that honors what we learned together." Thomas was escorted from the pens. He stood outside in the morning light, broken and furious and helpless. He wanted to burn the city down, wanted to murder his mother-in-law and every judge and politician and slave trader who made this system possible, wanted to tear apart every law and institution that allowed human beings to be caged and sold like animals. But violence would not save Ruth. Violence would only get him killed or imprisoned, leaving Caroline alone and unprotected. So he did the only thing he could do. He went to see a lawyer, not just any lawyer. Marcus Brennan was known throughout Virginia as a radical, one of the few attorneys who occasionally represented slaves in freedom suits. He was despised by most of the planter class, but respected for his legal brilliance. Thomas laid out the situation. Brennan listened carefully, asked detailed questions, reviewed all the documentation. "Your mother-in-law has been thorough," Brennan said finally. "The case against Ruth is solid by the standards of Virginia law. She is literate, she taught a child, she possessed forbidden materials. The sentence is legally sound. So there is nothing to be done." "I did not say that. There is one possibility, but it is extremely risky and depends on you being willing to do something radical." "Anything," Thomas said. "Tell me." Brennan leaned forward. "You could claim that you gave Ruth permission to educate herself and your daughter, that you knew about her literacy from the beginning and authorized it. This would transfer the crime from her to you. What would happen to me? You would face criminal charges, likely a significant fine, possibly jail time, depending on the judge. Your reputation would be destroyed, but Ruth's sentence might be commuted. Instead of being sold south, she might simply be confiscated and re-auctioned locally, which would give you the opportunity to repurchase her, assuming you still have funds after paying the fine. And if I do not have enough funds, then you lose everything," Brennan said bluntly. "Your property, your plantation, possibly even custody of your daughter, if the court decides you are an unfit parent. This is not a small risk, Mr. Whitmore. This is betting everything on a legal strategy that might not work." Thomas thought of Caroline's face when she learned Ruth was gone. Thought of Ruth sitting in that cage, accepting her fate with dignity. Thought of his wife drowning in the river because she could not live in a world built on lies and cruelty. "Do it," he said. "File whatever documents you need to file. I will testify to anything required." "Mr. Whitmore," Brennan said carefully, "you need to understand what you are risking here." "I understand perfectly," Thomas interrupted. "I am risking my comfort and my status and my place in a society that profits from human suffering. I am risking things that never should have been mine in the first place, built as they were on the labor of people I had no right to own. File the papers. Today." Brennan smiled for the first time. "You are either a brave man or a fool, Mr. Whitmore, possibly both, but I will help you." The legal battle that followed became notorious throughout Virginia. Thomas Whitmore, respected plantation owner, publicly admitted to authorizing a slave to read and to teach his daughter. He testified in court that he believed literacy was a human right and that Virginia's laws against slave education were unjust and immoral. The scandal was immediate and comprehensive. Thomas's business partners withdrew their investments. His line of credit to the bank was revoked. Former friends crossed the street to avoid speaking to him. His mother-in-law used every connection she possessed to ensure that Thomas Whitmore became a pariah, a cautionary tale about what happened when white men betrayed their race and class. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The courtroom was packed every day with people who came to witness the spectacle of a plantation owner destroying himself to save a slave. Some came to mock, Others came out of morbid curiosity. A few came because they secretly sympathized but would never dare say so publicly. Thomas testified for 2 full days. He described how Ruth had saved Caroline from grief that was killing her, how she had taught them both to see the humanity in people, the law defined as property, how she had demonstrated intellectual and moral capacity that equaled or exceeded anyone in that courtroom, how the laws that prohibited slave literacy were designed not to protect society but to maintain an unjust system through enforced ignorance. The prosecutor, a man named Harrison Thorne, who had political ambitions and saw this case as an opportunity to make his reputation, was merciless. "Mr. Whitmore," he said on the 3rd day of testimony, his voice dripping with contempt, "do you truly expect this court to believe that you, a man of education and standing, genuinely consider a Negro slave to be your intellectual equal?" "I do not consider her my equal," Thomas replied calmly. "I consider her my superior. Ruth has maintained dignity and compassion in circumstances that would have broken most people. She has educated herself against tremendous obstacles. She has loved and taught and survived horrors that I cannot fully comprehend. If character and intelligence were truly what determined human worth, she would own me, not the reverse." The courtroom erupted. The judge pounded his gavel, calling for order. Thorne smiled, knowing he had gotten exactly the quote he wanted for the newspapers. "So you admit," Thorne pressed, "that you believe the natural order of society is fundamentally wrong, that the Negro race should not be subordinate to the white race?" Thomas met his eyes steadily. "I admit that I was raised to believe comfortable lies, that some people deserve freedom and others deserve chains, that skin color determines human value, that slavery is a necessary evil rather than simply evil. Ruth taught me the truth, that these beliefs are not natural law, but rather a system designed to benefit some at the expense of others. Yes, I believe that system is wrong. Completely, morally, inexcusably wrong." The prosecutor had what he needed. The defense rested. The judge, a stern man in his 60s named Cyrus Blackwood, deliberated for 2 days. When he returned with his verdict, the courtroom was silent. "Mr. Whitmore," Judge Blackwood began, "you have admitted to crimes against the Commonwealth of Virginia. You have violated laws designed to maintain social order and protect public safety. Your actions have been reckless and dangerous. The prosecutor has asked that you be imprisoned for 5 years and that all your property, including your slaves and your plantation, be confiscated and sold to pay your fines." Thomas felt his stomach drop. 5 years. Caroline would be 11 years old when he was released. She would have grown up without him, likely placed with his mother-in-law, all of Ruth's teaching systematically undone. However, Judge Blackwood continued, and Thomas's head snapped up. "I find myself in an unusual position. I am required to uphold the law as written, but I am also required to consider the full context of a case. And the context here is that you committed your crime not for personal gain, not out of malice or rebellion, but out of love for your daughter and respect for another human being." The judge paused, looking directly at Thomas. "I do not agree with your views on slavery, Mr. Whitmore. I believe the institution is necessary for the economic stability of the South and that the Negro race requires white guidance and control. But I cannot fault a father for trying to save his child's life, and I cannot ignore the fact that by all accounts your daughter has thrived under Ruth's care." He shuffled his papers. "Therefore, I am imposing a fine of $2,000 and confiscation of your slave Ruth to be re-auctioned. However, I am not imposing a prison sentence. You will be allowed to retain your plantation and your other property. You may bid on Ruth at auction like any other potential buyer. If you can pay your fine and still afford to purchase her, the law permits it." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Thorne was on his feet, objecting furiously. This was a slap on the wrist, he shouted. This would encourage other masters to flout the law. Judge Blackwood gabbled him down. "My decision is final," the judge said coldly. "Mr. Whitmore, you have 10 days to pay your fine. Ruth will be auctioned in 2 weeks. Court is adjourned." Thomas sagged in his chair, relief and terror flooding through him in equal measure. $2,000 was a staggering sum, but it was possible. He could sell his tobacco crop early, take loans against future harvests. He could do it. But then he would need additional funds to bid on Ruth at auction, and his mother-in-law would certainly be there, bidding against him, driving the price up as high as possible out of pure spite. He met with Marcus Brennan immediately after the verdict. "You need approximately $3,000 total," Brennan calculated. $2,000 for the fine, and I estimate at least another $1,000 to outbid your enemies at the auction. Your mother-in-law will want to punish you by forcing you to pay as much as possible, or by winning the bid herself and selling Ruth south out of pure vindictiveness. "I can get the money," Thomas said, though he was not entirely sure how. "I will sell everything if necessary." "There is another option," Brennan said carefully. "You could liquidate your entire operation. Sell the plantation, sell your slaves, pay the fine, buy Ruth and leave Virginia. Start over somewhere else, somewhere with less rigid social hierarchies. Pennsylvania, perhaps, or even further north. You would be poor, but you would be free of this system." Thomas sat in silence, considering. Everything he knew was in Virginia. His family's history, his father's legacy, the only life he had ever lived. Leaving would mean abandoning all of it. But staying would mean continuing to participate in slavery. He could free Ruth, but he would still own 36 other human beings. He could tell himself he was a good master, but he would still be a master. The system would still be a master. The system would still be intact. Ruth's words came back to him. "Let my legacy be their freedom." He looked at Brennan. "How quickly could we sell everything? If you are serious, probably 3 months. Plantation sales take time, but slave sales can happen within weeks. You can have the funds together before Ruth's auction date." "Do it," Thomas said. "Sell it all. The plantation, the slaves, everything. I will pay the fine, buy Ruth her freedom, and we will leave Virginia." "Are you certain?" Brennan asked. "This is not a decision you can undo." "I have never been more certain of anything," Thomas said. "This is what Ruth asked me to do. This is what my daughter needs to see. That principle matters more than property. That justice is worth any price." Over the next 10 days, Thomas sold his tobacco crop, his farming equipment, his furniture, everything of value. He paid his $2,000 fine with a day to spare. Then he began the process of selling his plantation and his slaves, but he did not sell them in the traditional sense. Instead, with Brennan's help, he offered each enslaved person on his property a choice. He would pay the legal fees to manumit them, giving them their freedom papers. They could then leave Virginia and try to make lives as free people in the North, though this was dangerous and difficult. Or they could wait to be sold to new masters when the plantation was auctioned. Most chose freedom despite the risks. Thomas used the money from selling his plantation to pay for their manumission papers and to give each freed person a small amount of money to help them start their new lives. It was not nearly enough compensation for years of unpaid labor, but it was something. It was acknowledgement that they were owed a debt that could never truly be repaid. Some chose to stay in Virginia and take their chances with new masters, fearing the uncertainty of freedom more than the certainty of servitude. Thomas respected their choice, though it broke his heart. The process took weeks longer than he had hoped. Ruth's auction date arrived before he had liquidated everything. On the morning of the auction, Thomas stood in the Richmond slave market with $4,000 in his pocket, money cobbled together from every source he could find. It had to be enough. It had to be. The auction was packed. His mother-in-law was there in the front row, dressed in black like she was attending a funeral. Perhaps she was, Thomas thought. The funeral of his social standing, his family connections, his place in Virginia society. Ruth was brought out with a group of other slaves, all of them being sold south. She looked thinner than when he had last seen her, her eyes hollow with resignation. But when she saw him in the crowd, something flickered in her face. Not hope, exactly, but recognition, acknowledgement that he had not abandoned her. The auctioneer began the bidding at $500, standard for a healthy female slave. Thomas immediately bid $600. His mother-in-law bid $700. The auction became a duel between them, the price climbing rapidly. $1,000, $1,200, $1,500, $2,000. People were watching now, fascinated by this public battle. Everyone knew the backstory. Everyone understood what was really being bid on here. Not a slave, but principles. Not property, but souls. $2,500, Thomas called out, his voice steady though his heart was pounding. $3,000, Margaret countered immediately, her face flushed with triumph. She knew she was hurting him with every bid. 3,500, Thomas said. 4,000, Margaret said, and smiled at him. A cruel, satisfied smile. Thomas had $4,000. That was everything. If he bid higher, he would not have enough money left to transport Caroline and Ruth out of Virginia, to feed them, to start over somewhere else. They would be destitute. But if he did not bid higher, Ruth would be sold to his mother-in-law, who would make certain she suffered for the rest of her life. He thought of Caroline, waiting at home for news. Thought of his promise to bring Ruth back. Thought of Ruth sitting in that cage, asking him to free his other slaves. Thought of his wife, drowning in the river rather than continue living a lie. $4,500, Thomas said clearly. It was money he did not have, but he would find it somehow. He would beg, borrow, sell his own clothes if necessary. Margaret's smile faltered. 5,000, she said, but there was uncertainty in her voice now. This was becoming expensive even for her, and she was not certain how far he would go. $6,000, Thomas said, and his voice rang out across the silent auction yard. Final offer. I will pay $6,000 for Ruth's freedom, and I will not stop bidding until either I own her or you bankrupt yourself out of spite. The crowd murmured. This was unprecedented. $6,000 for a single slave, one who was being sold as punishment rather than for her market value. Margaret stood, her face twisted with rage. You are a fool, Thomas Whitmore, a fool who has destroyed himself for a slave. I hope you and your mongrel-loving daughter rot in poverty. She swept from the auction yard. No one else bid against Thomas. Going once, the auctioneer called, clearly shocked by the price. Going twice. Sold to Thomas Whitmore for $6,000. Thomas's legs nearly gave out. $6,000. He had just committed to paying money he absolutely did not possess. Ruth was brought to him, her shackles removed. She looked at him with tears streaming down her face. "What have you done?" she whispered. "That money could have freed 20 slaves, 30. Why did you spend it all on me?" "Because Caroline needs you," Thomas said simply. "Because I need you. Because you are worth more than money can measure. And because I am going to find a way to pay this debt, even if it takes me the rest of my life." The only way he could raise the additional $2,000 needed to pay the full auction price was to sell his late wife's jewelry, the last valuable items he possessed. These were pieces that had been in her family for generations, pieces he had planned to give to Caroline when she was older. He sold them all, and it broke his heart, but it was the only option. When the transaction was complete and Ruth was legally his property, Thomas immediately went with Brennan to file manumission papers. Within hours, Ruth ceased to be a slave. She was legally free. They stood outside the courthouse, Ruth holding her freedom papers with shaking hands, staring at the document that said she owned herself. "I never thought I would see these again," she said softly. "I thought I would die in chains." "You will never wear chains again," Thomas promised. "From this moment forward, you are free to go wherever you wish, to do whatever you wish. If you want to leave Virginia, I will give you money for travel. If you want to stay, I will help you establish yourself. The choice is yours. You owe me nothing." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. "I owe you everything. You sacrificed your entire life for me." "No," Thomas said. "I sacrificed a life built on injustice. You and Caroline taught me that such a life was not worth keeping. Now I have a chance to build something better, and I hope, if you are willing, that you will help me build it." "Where will you go?" Ruth asked. "North," Thomas said. "Probably Philadelphia, maybe further. Somewhere Caroline can grow up without learning to despise herself for treating people with dignity. Somewhere we can live without constantly looking over our shoulders." He paused. "I want you to come with us, not as a servant, as family, as Caroline's teacher and my friend and an equal partner in whatever life we build." Ruth's eyes filled with fresh tears. "You cannot mean that. Society will destroy you for it. A white man traveling with a free black woman, raising a child together. You will face violence and hatred everywhere you go." "Then we will face it together," Thomas said. I'm tired of basing my decisions on what society demands. Society demands cruelty, and I choose kindness. Society demands hierarchy, and I choose equality. Society demands that I see you as less than human, and I choose to see you as you are, extraordinary, brilliant, compassionate, and brave. Ruth laughed through her tears. You are insane, but yes, I will come with you, for Caroline's sake and for my own, because despite everything, despite all the suffering and loss, I am not ready to give up on finding joy in this world. And I think maybe with you and that remarkable child, I might actually find it. They returned to the plantation together. Caroline was waiting on the porch, having watched the road for hours. When she saw Ruth step down from the carriage, free and unshackled, the child's scream of joy could be heard across the fields. She ran to Ruth and threw herself into her arms. Ruth caught her and held her close, both of them crying and laughing at the same time. "You came back," Caroline sobbed. "You came back." "I promised I would," Ruth said, though it was Thomas who had made that promise, but it was true enough. "I promised I would not leave you, and I never will again." Over the next month, they prepared to leave Virginia. Thomas finished selling everything he owned. With the money that remained, after paying all his debts, he had about $800, enough to travel north, rent a small house, and survive for perhaps 6 months while he looked for work. He said goodbye to Fletcher, who had loyally managed the plantation to the end and who looked at Thomas with a mixture of pity and incomprehension. "You are making a terrible mistake," Fletcher said. "But I respect your courage, even if I think you are throwing away everything for nothing." "Not for nothing," Thomas said, "for everything that truly matters." On a cool morning in September 1852, 1 year after Thomas had first purchased Ruth at the Richmond slave market, 3 people boarded a northbound train. Thomas Whitmore, former plantation owner, now penniless. Ruth Mitchell, as she now called herself, reclaiming her mother's maiden name, a free woman carrying her official papers like a talisman, and Caroline Whitmore, 7 years old, who carried a satchel full of books and infinite hope in her heart. They had no home waiting for them, no guaranteed employment, no safety net. But they had each other, and they had chosen to build their lives on truth rather than lies, on justice rather than convenience. The journey north was difficult. They faced constant suspicion and hostility. Hotel owners who refused to rent them rooms because Ruth was with them. Restaurant owners who served them grudgingly or not at all. Other travelers who made comments about race mixing and corruption of children, but they also found unexpected allies. Quakers who offered them shelter and food. Abolitionists who helped them find housing in Philadelphia. Freed black communities who welcomed Ruth as one of their own and accepted Thomas and Caroline because of who they stood with rather than what they looked like. Thomas found work as a bookkeeper in a shipping firm. It was humble work compared to running a plantation, but it was honest work that did not depend on human bondage. Ruth found work teaching in a school for freed black children. It was dangerous work, as such schools were often targets for arson and violence, but it allowed her to use her gifts in a way that honored her suffering, and Caroline thrived. She attended a progressive Quaker school where she learned alongside children of all races. She grew into a fierce and passionate advocate for abolition. By the time she was 12, she was writing articles for abolitionist newspapers under a pseudonym. By 16, she was speaking at public meetings about her experiences, about the courage it took for her father to dismantle his privilege, about the wisdom Ruth had taught her. Years later, after the Civil War finally ended slavery throughout the United States, after all the blood and suffering and transformation, Caroline Whitmore became a teacher herself. She founded a school in Philadelphia that educated children regardless of race or background. She never married, dedicating her life instead to education and justice. Thomas lived to see the 13th Amendment passed, abolishing slavery forever. He was in his 50s by then, gray-haired and worn but unbowed. He lived simply in a small house in Philadelphia with Ruth, who everyone assumed was his housekeeper, but who was actually his closest companion and intellectual partner. They never married, knowing that such a union would bring violence down on all of them, but they built a life together that honored love without requiring legal recognition of it. They read together in the evenings. They discussed philosophy and politics. They watched Caroline grow into the kind of woman who would change the world. Ruth died in her sleep in 1873 at the age of 57, worn out by years of hard work, but peaceful at the end. Her last words to Thomas were, "We did it. We built something beautiful out of all that ugliness. We proved that love is stronger than hate, that justice is worth any sacrifice." Thomas lived another decade, dying in 1883 at the age of 70. His last words were to Caroline, who sat beside his bed holding his hand. "I have no regrets," he told her. "Not about leaving Virginia, not about giving up the plantation, not about choosing love over law. You and Ruth taught me what it means to be fully human. That is worth more than all the wealth in the world." Caroline wrote their story in a memoir published in 1885. It became a minor sensation in abolitionist circles. People read it and were inspired by the courage of a man who dismantled his own privilege and a woman who maintained her dignity through unimaginable suffering. But the real story, the one that mattered most, was simpler than any memoir could capture. It was the story of a desperate father who trusted a slave with his daughter and discovered that the categories he had been taught to believe in, slave and free, white and black, superior and inferior, were all lies designed to justify cruelty. What he discovered instead was that humanity transcends all such categories, that love recognizes no boundaries, that courage sometimes means tearing down everything you have built and starting over with nothing but your principles and the people you love. The night Thomas Whitmore first heard his daughter singing with Ruth, first saw them reading together by lamplight, was the night his entire world changed. Not because anything illegal was happening, though it was, not because the social order was being violated, though it was, but because in that moment he saw the truth that Ruth and Caroline had already understood, that the person teaching his daughter was not property, not inferior, not something less than human. She was a woman of extraordinary gifts who had survived suffering that would have destroyed weaker people. She was a teacher who understood the human heart better than any scholar. She was a person deserving of freedom and dignity and love, and the choice he made in that moment to protect them rather than punish them, to learn from them rather than control them, to dismantle his privilege rather than maintain it, that choice changed everything. It cost him his plantation, his social standing, his family connections, his wealth. It gave him his soul. In the end, that night that shocked everyone was not shocking because of what happened in that nursery. Reading lessons and songs are simple things. It was shocking because of what happened after, because a man looked at the system he had inherited and said, "This is wrong," because a slave woman who had every reason to be broken found the strength to teach and love and hope, because a child learned that justice is more important than comfort and carried that lesson into a lifetime of fighting for the powerless. Their story reminds us that the deepest revolutions happen not in battlefields or legislatures, but in individual hearts. When one person decides that another person's freedom matters more than their own convenience, when one person chooses to see humanity in someone the law defines as property, when one person has the courage to burn down their entire life and build something new on the ashes. That is the story that lives on in the sealed room of history, where uncomfortable truths are hidden away because they force us to question everything we think we know. The truth that Thomas Whitmore learned from a woman named Ruth, the truth that his daughter Caroline spent her lifetime trying to teach others, the truth that echoes forward through generations, that love is not bound by law, that justice is not negotiable, that human dignity cannot be bought or sold, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply seeing another person as they truly are and refusing to look away, no matter what it costs you. Tell me from which city you are hearing the story tonight. Which moment touched your deepest heart? Was it Caroline's courage in that Richmond dining room, speaking truth when silence would have been safer? Was it Thomas's choice to sacrifice everything he owned for one person's freedom? Or was it Ruth's strength, teaching and loving even when the world tried to break her? Leave a comment about what courage means to you after hearing this story. What would you be willing to sacrifice for justice? What truth have you been afraid to speak? Because these questions matter. These questions define who we are. And if this story moved something in your soul, if it made you think differently about privilege and sacrifice and what it means to truly see another person's humanity, then subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. because the only way we honor the courage of people like Ruth and Thomas and Carolyn is by carrying their truth forward, by refusing to look away from injustice, by choosing love over fear, principle over profit, and humanity over hierarchy. The night that shocked everyone was not just one night in 1851. It is every night when someone chooses courage over comfort. It is every moment when love proves stronger than the laws designed to suppress it. It is every time someone looks at another human being and says, "You matter. Your freedom matters. Your dignity matters. And I will stand with you no matter what it costs." That is the story. That is the truth. That is the legacy. And it lives on in every person brave enough to believe that justice is worth any price, that love transcends all boundaries, and that the courage to do what is right matters more than the comfort of doing what is easy.